Chapter 561. To be exact, theirs isn't a huge effect. Strix turned around. This was a mere side effect of the rejection. The sleeper virus has a relatively stubborn cell. When the vaccine is injected into the body, those cells that spread will start to become active and accelerate the metabolism. His body cannot bear it, but he won't die. Maisie paused and pressed her lips together. If she knew that the vaccine would cause such a huge reaction to rejection, she might not have taken the chance. Strix consoled her, "You don't need to feel bad. I initially planned to let Adrian use that vaccine for research. Even if you didn't inform Erwin to make him take precautions, he would still have 2 vaccines with him at that time. No matter which type it was. They didn't affect Nolan negatively, but it just didn't let Sue and Roger get their way." After Strix left, Maisie stood there alone until someone said, "I wasn't expecting you to be behind the vaccine issue." Maisie didn't turn around, but she knew it was Sue. Sue walked in front of her and scoffed. "I started off with Mr. Goldman's well-being in mind, but you, his ex-wife, are trying to frame me for this. Do you really not care about his life? What about you?" Maisie looked at her with no change in expression. "You injected him without understanding what is in the vaccine." Sue's expression changed. "That was because you interfered." She approached Maisie. "If Elder Master Goldman finds out that you are the reason his grandson is in this predicament, do you think you'll get away with your plan?" Sue's eyes were cold as Maisie kept quiet. "I heard that Elder Master Goldman doesn't like you. Since you're already divorced. Suggest you keep out of this, by the way." Sue smiled. "Mr. Goldman doesn't hate me. Maybe he already stopped loving you?" Maisie looked at her calmly. After a while, she smiled without warmth. "Congratulations then, Ms. Reynolds. I accept your blessing." Sue patted her shoulder, turned around, and left. Maisie watched her leave, her eyes turning dark. During the few days that Nolan had been in a coma, the ineffectiveness of the vaccine caused a stir. The hottest debate was on Henry's exposed identity. The biggest loser was probably Roger. He monopolized the vaccine supply chain and was barred from entering other countries. His plan to turn things around with the vaccine had utterly failed. But what the media didn't know was that Nolan had been awake for 2 days. Quincy stood by the bed and reported, "Mr. Goldman. After you let me announce that the vaccine isn't effective on you, the people lost their trust in Roger. All the vaccines that were tied to him have been rejected." Nolan stood in front of the window, his thin hands playing with the potted plant on the windowsill. Strix made a huge sacrifice too. Once the ineffectiveness was announced, his reputation was dragged through the mud, and everyone found out that he was Henry. The hospital was well guarded, so people couldn't get in. The hospital staff was paid to keep the secret so no one outside could know Nolan's situation. Roger had lost his power, and after David resolved the issues, he would be voted as the new president of Staslow if nothing went wrong. Chapter 562. Something came to Quincy's mind. "By the way, Sue has been coming to see you for the past few days. I'm not sure how she found out that Mr. Vanderbilt framed her about the vaccine, and she told Elder Master Goldman about this. He believes her and blames Ms. Vanderbilt for it." Nolan paused what he was doing and turned sideways, his eyes looking dark and lonely. A silver-white car slowly drove into the yellow poplar forest. The wide lawn and the rows of tall poplar trees looked like an oil painting under the bright blue sky. This beautiful yet secluded area was where Adrian lived. Sadie parked the car outside a 3-story tall villa with its own lawn. The doors were tightly shut. Maisie got out of the car. Sadie rang the doorbell, and someone came to the door after a long time. The man looked out from behind the door and asked, "Who are you? Is Mr. Kessner in?" "No." Sadie suddenly kicked the door as the man was about to close it. The man took out a gun to defend himself. But Sadie immobilized him on the floor immediately, took his gun, and pointed it at his head. Sadie knocked the man out upon hearing movement upstairs and entered the villa with Maisie. There were signs of a struggle in the house. It was messy, and there was blood on the floor. There were signs of movements upstairs, so they both rushed toward the study. Sadie kicked the door with a gun in hand, but all they saw was Jones tied to a chair. He had kicked over a vase to make some noise. Maisie was surprised. "Mr. Smith?" She immediately went forward to untie him and removed the tape over his mouth. Jones was out of breath when he finally got to speak. "Roger's people took my uncle. They wanted to keep me here so that I couldn't report it." Sadie put her gun away and frowned. "I guess Mr. Goldman was right. Roger wasn't going to let Mr. Kestner get away." They were still too late. Maisie helped him up and saw blood gushing out of a wound on his calf. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. By the way, how did you get in?" "That man dash Maisie cut him off. Sadie knocked him out. You need to get to the hospital. We'll send you there." Sadie drove toward the nearest hospital in the city. Jones turned paler by the minute in the car. Blood kept gushing out, possibly because of compression of blood vessels. And a big part of his pants was soaked. Maisie wrapped a cloth around an inch above his wound. Jones looked at her and smiled weakly. "I'm glad you showed up. I thought I was going to die there." Maisie looked at him. "When was Mr. Kestner taken?" He answered. "An hour ago." The men had taken him away after rushing in and fighting the bodyguards. Jones realized that something was wrong when he came to see Adrian and was ambushed when he got through the door. He had already been tied up by the time he woke up. That person had been keeping an eye on him because he was afraid that he would report it. That person had had to leave upon hearing the doorbell, so Jones deliberately broke a vase, but it cut his calf when it shattered. At the hospital, the doctor immediately helped Jones stop the bleeding while Maisie waited outside. Sadie walked over after making a call. "Ma'am, I've informed Mr. Goldman about this. He has sent someone to save Mr. Kestner." Maisie nodded. Since no one knew Nolan's status and it had been chaotic, Roger had been cornered and couldn't do anything to Strix. Still, he could take it out on Adrian. Chapter 563. As to why they had only tied up Jones, it was probably because of his family background. He was the only son in his family, unlike Adrian. The doctor walked out of the ward when Maisie asked, "How's Mr. Smith?" The doctor smiled. "He was lucky to get here in time. And he didn't go into hemorrhagic shock. I gave him stitches, and he just needs to rest for a few days." Maisie walked into the room. Jones was lying in bed as he looked back at her. "Thanks. Don't mention it." Maisie stood next to the bed. "When we met back in Luxella, I asked about Ms. Reynolds and your uncle. Were you trying to help your uncle keep a secret?" He had avoided the topic because he wanted to keep it a secret. Jones paused and smiled, looking pale. "My uncle didn't work with Roger. He was a fan of experiments. How do I put this? He had been obsessed with his own experiments and ignored the outside world and the objections of his family. So he left your family?" Maisie had heard Nolan mention that someone had left the Jones family a long time ago, and that was probably Adrian. Jones nodded and looked at the ceiling. His dream was to be as good as Strix. "In Staslow, aside from the Kents, Roger always knew that my uncle was doing his research. When the scandal of the Kents being involved in the virus research had broken out, Roger was afraid it would lead back to him. Thus, he approached his uncle. I don't know how Roger found my uncle, because he rarely has communication with the outside world." Maisie walked aside, running her hand along the edge of the cabinet. "Maybe it was Sue Reynolds?" Jones stared at her at the mention of Sue. "Why are you so interested in Sue?" Maisie stopped in front of the window. The sun rays that shone on her body made the lines of her face look softer against the light, because she isn't Sue Reynolds. Jones pushed himself up. "She isn't Sue?" I visited Luxella that day to get her information. The Sue that I knew worked at Luxella 9 years ago. I have all the information about her, and this Sue is different from the Sue that I knew. Maisie turned sideways to look at him after saying that. Sue died in a fire 3 years ago. The death certificate issued by the hospital was still saved on the server. Jones was stunned. He didn't know Sue very well, but he was aware that she was his uncle's student, and he didn't know her before that. If she's an impostor. Could it be possible that my uncle wasn't aware? Jones was curious about that. Maisie smiled. Do you know how to pretend? She used to be one of the closest people to Sue and knew the people around her, including everything about her. Adrian would not be able to tell that the current Sue wasn't his student from Turner. Other than the change in her looks, she must have said something to convince Adrian that she was Sue. At that moment, at the Central Hospital. Nonsense. Titus looked upset when he looked toward Nolan, who was sitting on the bed. If Maisie didn't switch the vaccines, would you be in this situation? He took a deep breath and held up his hand. I don't care what you think. You have to cut all ties with Maisie Vanderbilt. Chapter 564. Nolan closed his eyes and scoffed. What happens after we get a divorce? He opened his eyes while looking cold. I should accept Sue? Titus paused. Even though Sue had snatched the vaccine from Strix, she had done that to save Nolan. If they hadn't switched the vaccines, Nolan wouldn't be in such a dangerous predicament. Titus didn't fully trust Sue either, so he wouldn't try to push them together. Any woman other than Maisie would work. Nolan smiled, but he looked more sinister. It's been 3 years. But you still like to interfere in my affairs. Titus growled, I'm your grandfather, and I'm doing this for your own good. Even if what happened 3 years ago wasn't her fault, without her, you wouldn't have been infected and fallen into their trap. He knew that Maisie was innocent. But Nolan had almost lost his life ever since meeting her. He felt sorry for Maisie about the accident, but they should never have been together. They shouldn't still be in contact after their divorce. Nolan's eyes were dark. After a moment, he grinned. If it weren't for Maisie, I might be dead already. Why do you think Strix would want to help me? Titus paused and didn't say anything. Nolan scoffed again. You think they were manipulative, but without that, Sue would have gotten her way, or maybe it would have been Roger? He leaned against the headboard. Maybe my father was right. You never reflect on your decisions. Like it or not, what happened to Maisie and me was all because of you. What did you say, rascal? Titus looked pale, but Nolan closed his eyes and ignored him. All Titus could do was stare. After that, he threw his hands up and left. Quincy saw Titus get out of the room looking upset and didn't dare ask him about it. He walked into the room. Mr. Goldman, Elder Master Goldman, Nolan squinted and said in a deep voice, ignore him. The old man is just stubborn. He will regret it one day. Sue was blocked by the bodyguards when she walked into the corridor. She was going to say something when she saw Quincy exiting the room, so she immediately said, Mr. Lawson. Quincy looked at her and walked over with no change in expression. You're here? I'm here to see Mr. Goldman. How is he? Sue looked worried, and it wasn't an act. Quincy sighed. Mr. Goldman hasn't woken up yet. We don't know if he will. He just might not. Why? Sue paused and held Quincy's arm. Can you let me see him? Even just for a moment. Please? Quincy looked awkward. I don't think that's a good idea. Sue begged him. Please, Mr. Lawson, let me see him. Quincy didn't block her and asked the bodyguards to let her in. She quickly walked into the room. Her heart ached when she saw Nolan lying in bed. She had never thought of taking Nolan's life. She would never hurt him and just wanted him to love her, even just for a moment. It was all Maisie's fault for switching out the vaccine and putting him in this situation. That woman had done this. Sue slowly walked toward the bed, holding her fist. Her tightly pressed lips slowly parted. No, Nolan. Chapter 565. Seeing that the man in the bed wasn't reacting, she sat at the edge of the bed and touched his cold hand. Nolan, you can't die. I really didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted to save you. Sue's eyes welled up. Although she had only spent a short time with Nolan. Even if it was a Sue, she knew that he didn't hate Sue, and that was a good start. She finally had a chance, but why couldn't she save him? I'm sorry, Nolan. It was my fault. It was all because of Maisie. She wanted to frame me and switch out the vaccine. I really didn't know that it would have such a huge effect on you, Nolan. I really don't want you to die. Sue's hand touched his face. What are you doing? A sudden voice came from outside, startling Sue. She turned around and saw Maisie standing at the door, staring back. Sue looked at Nolan and stood up with a stoic expression. You switched out the vaccines and caused this. How could you still show your face here? Maisie slowly said, you betrayed Mr. Kestner and worked with Roger. I just wanted to stop you. Sue pressed her lips together. Maisie walked to Sue. I'm sure you know what is going on between Roger and the Goldmans. How could I let Roger get this chance and not do anything about it? Sue gnashed her teeth. So you treat Mr. Goldman's life as a joke? Maisie approached her and revealed a knowing smile. Weren't you the reason the virus infected Nolan? What do you mean? Sue's expression changed, and she tried to avoid eye contact. Why would Maisie say this to her? It's exactly what you heard. Maisie placed her hand on her shoulder and smiled. Why are you agitated? Are you hiding something? Sue held her fists because she had a bad feeling. Had Maisie found something? That wasn't possible. She had covered it so well, so how could she find out? Did you know? I knew a girl in Luxella 9 years ago. Also named Sue Reynolds. That sentence made Sue shudder, and her fingers turned pale. Maisie walked to her side. I'm curious, not only is Sue, who died 3 years ago in a fire, standing here, very much alive, but she doesn't even recognize me. If you didn't die in that fire. Who did? I have no idea. I was already in the hospital when I regained my senses. My face was badly burned, and that was why I got plastic surgery. I can't remember a lot of things. Sue gnashed her teeth to calm down. She couldn't fall into the trap. Really? Maisie turned to look at her and raised her brow. You can change your face, but I can't find any traces of Sue on you. I'm really curious how you could turn into a whole new person in 3 years. And your body reminds me of another woman. Sue started sweating. Maisie stood beside her, and 2 words floated over to her ears. Rowena Summers. Those words were like a nightmare to her, haunting her. She couldn't get away from it, forever circling the identity hidden deep in this body. Thus, her body froze when Maisie mentioned her name. And she started having trouble breathing. No, she wasn't Rowena Summers. Chapter 566. I'm Sue Reynolds. Sue kept saying the name in her heart, again and again, telling herself that she was Sue Reynolds. Sue turned her head around and met Maisie's gaze. She said with a smile on her face, I'm sorry, but I have no idea who this is. Although I don't know what prejudice you have against me, what is the purpose of you doing this to me? I just want to tell you that I want the best for Mr. Goldman. A slap landed on Sue's face, causing her to turn her head sideways. She was stunned for a short while. And then she hissed angrily. How dare you slap me? You want the best for him? Haha, please don't make me laugh. Maisie said as she rubbed her wrist. Then, she looked at Sue, whose face was clouded with a paroxysm of anger, shock, and ruthlessness. What? Don't give me that face. Sue raised her arm as she wanted to slap Maisie back. Maisie just stood there and looked at her straight. Before Sue's hand could reach Maisie's face, Sadie grabbed her arm and pinned her on the floor, forcing her to kneel. She shouted, "How dare you? Maisie! What's wrong? Not going to keep on with your act?" Maisie leaned forward and looked at her with a faint smile on her face. "I just slapped you once, and you can't take it anymore?" Sue avoided her eyes. Even though she was furious right now. She pressed it down and said through gritted teeth, "You'd better let me go now. Or else, I'll tell Mr. Goldman and let him see your true face." "Sure. I'll give you a chance to tell him." Maisie rose to her feet and walked up to Nolan's bed. She sat down and said, "Wakey, wakey. How long are you going to pretend to sleep? Or do you want me to kiss you to wake you up?" The corner of Nolan's lips curled upward slightly, and he opened up his eyes to look at her. "Seems like you're having a lot of fun. Mr. Goldman?" Sue was stunned. Nolan slowly got up from his bed. The smile on his face gradually faded and was replaced by grim coldness. "You're not going to call me Nolan anymore?" Sue's face was as pale as a sheet of paper, and it took her a while to understand everything. She looked at Nolan and asked in disbelief. "Why?" If he had been pretending to be asleep, did that mean that he had heard everything she said just now? Nolan dusted his hospital gown slowly and replied in an indifferent manner. "I've known you were not the real Sue from the moment you approached me as Strix's apprentice." Sue bit her lips, and her entire body was shaking profusely as if she had lost all her strength. "So, you have been testing me the whole time?" she asked. "Of course," Nolan said, his face cold. "Did you think I'd be interested in you just because you've changed a new face?" Sue felt as if her entire world had shattered. So he knew from the beginning, and he's been testing me all along. It was only now she realized why Nolan wanted her to wear high heels or make snacks for him. It turned out that he had just been testing her and confirming her identity. There was a moment when she thought Nolan really had fallen for her. She believed she had a chance. After all, he had gotten a divorce from Maisie, but everything he had said in the car was a lie. He had just wanted to give her the wrong impression that she had a chance to be with him again. That's right. He could sacrifice his own life and take the bullet for Maisie 3 years ago. How could there be a chance he would have a change of heart 3 years later? "I'm really such a fool." Sue tossed her head back and let out a hysterical peal of laughter. "All of you are lying to me. How dare you take advantage of my feelings, Nolan?" She tried to get up from the floor, but Sadie did not give her a chance. Narrowing his eyes, Nolan said, "Your feelings are way too cheap. From what you did 3 years ago, you should have thought about what would happen to you." "What would happen to me?" The hatred and resentment in Sue's eyes grew as she said, "Does Maisie not deserve to die? How could Daniel have tortured me if she hadn't schemed against me 3 years ago? My face was disfigured because of that." Chapter 567. Maisie's face sank. She said, "I remember I gave you a chance to admit it, right?" Rowena was stumped. Maisie rose to her feet and stopped in front of Rowena. She looked down at her and continued. "Rowena, I knew you didn't want to work for Daniel back then. I gave you a chance, but you didn't appreciate it. Why would I plot against you? It's because you participated in Daniel's plan. You were the one who pulled the trigger. You were the one who kidnapped me and lured Nolan into Daniel's trap. And now you're saying that you truly love him?" Maisie cupped her chin with her hands and said, "If you truly loved Nolan, you wouldn't have put him in danger, nor would you have watched his mother die back then." Rowena's pupils constricted, and she felt as if her organs had twisted together. Maisie continued. "Do you know that it's exactly because you refused to save and even hid the information about Nolan's mother that made him lose his mother? So what makes you think that the Goldman or Nolan should accept you?" Rowena, whose cover had been blown, could no longer continue to masquerade as Sue. Tears began to flow down Rowena's cheeks as she closed her eyes in despair. It was her cowardice back then that had created the situation today. She had made them miss the time to rescue Nolan's mother because she was afraid. She had been unaware of who had kidnapped Nolan's mother at that time. However, she had been aware of the feud between the Goldmans and the d'Arma family. Therefore, she had made the d'Arma family the scapegoat for this incident. Daniel approached her several years later. And her nightmare began. It was only then she learned that the ones who had kidnapped Nolan's mother were the Kents. She regretted it. She shouldn't have made a deal with the devil. Even if the Goldmans found out everything and she had nowhere to go one day, she would still have Daniel to help her. She had even thought that Daniel would be obsessed with her body, but she was wrong. He had been a monster, crueler than anyone she had ever seen. He would never have fallen for any woman. He would only treat women as his prey or pawns that he could take advantage of. His tortures would make her feel nothing but pain. She had had enough of Daniel's torture 3 years ago, so she escaped from him and became Sue. Nolan, I really didn't mean it. I didn't want to hurt you. I'm very sorry about your mother, I was just too sore, Rowena explained hastily. I was worried that you, Grandpa and your father would blame me, so you pushed all the blame to the d'Arma family? Maisie chimed in nonchalantly, cutting her short. It's your selfishness. A seemingly harmless thought that has allowed the d'Arma family to be used by those people for many years. Do you think you are really innocent? Shut up. Rowena growled, her voice laced with hatred. Those people used the d'Arma family? It's none of my business. I just knew there was a feud between the d'Arma family and the Goldmans, so what's wrong for me to blame the d'Arma family? After Rowena finished speaking, she let out a maniacal peal of laughter. Maisie, I know you hate me, but so do I. Those people are dead because of you. Winona. Her parents, or your father. Think about it, Maisie. If you had died, none of them would have had to die. Maisie's face was turning grimmer, and she clenched her hands so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. Quincy was standing outside the door. So, this is the reason you killed my sister? Rowena was stunned for a moment, and then she shouted hysterically, this is not my fault. No one asked her to protect this bitch. If she hadn't followed this bitch around, she wouldn't have to die. A figure zipped past Maisie before she could do anything, and Rowena was sent flying across the air in the blink of an eye, hitting the corner of the table with a meaty smack. She let out a grunt, and all of the bottles on the table fell to the floor. Chapter 568. Everyone in the ward gasped when they saw what had happened to Rowena. Rowena was lying on the floor in a prostrate position, twitching with pain. She raised her head, and under her messy hair was her face, which was filled with shock and tears. Nolan. How could you do this to me? Rowena couldn't believe that Nolan was willing to do this to her. He had never done something like this to her before, but at this moment, she saw nothing but ruthlessness, coldness, and mercilessness on his face. This is just a light punishment, considering what you've said, Nolan said as he glared coldly at her. I would have killed you if I could do it now. Kill me? Rowena felt a pang in her heart, and it began to constrict violently. Then, she cried out in a frenzied manner. What's wrong for me to call her a bitch? Do you feel upset? Nolan, if it weren't for my grandfather back then, the Goldmans wouldn't be where you are today. Rowena got up from the floor awkwardly. Her eyes were bloodshot, and there was a manic grin on her face. Do you want to kill me? Then do it now. Kill me, right now, and right here. I want to let everyone know that the Goldmans are a bunch of ungrateful people. Nolan laughed coldly. It might work on my grandfather, but unfortunately, it won't work on me. Rowena trembled, and she stumped. I don't care who you are. Since you've touched my bottom line, I'm not letting you get away so easily. Nolan turned his head away from her as he felt disgusted by the sight of her. Quincy, get someone to bring her away. Do whatever you want to her. No need to go easy on her. Due to his sister's death and the things that Rowena had said, Quincy no longer had any compassion for her, only disgust. He waved his hand, and 2 bodyguards came into the ward. They took hold of Rowena, causing the woman to scream madly, "Nolan! What are you doing? You can't do this to me, you can't." However, Nolan paid her no mind and allowed the 2 bodyguards to bring her away. Maisie stood frozen stiff at the spot for a long while before turning her head to look at Nolan. He was standing with his back facing her. But she could sense that he was enraged by the things Rowena had said. She could more or less imagine what would happen to Rowena after falling into Nolan's hands. Her hands were drenched with the blood of so many people, and she deserved more than death. However, could her death fill up the hole of hatred in her heart? Had it not been for her and Daniel to stage that accident, her father, Sherry, and even her baby wouldn't have died in that accident. She did not want Rowena dead. She wanted her to live as if she were dead. Nolan called out to her, trying to pull her back to reality. Maisie raised her head and looked at him. He stopped in front of her and stroked her cheek with his hand. "You can do whatever you want to do." Maisie was stunned. Then, she smiled. "Are you not worried that I might kill her?" Nolan chuckled and replied, "I know you won't let her die so easily." Rowena was imprisoned in a dimly lit room. A few bodyguards were guarding the room outside, and there was nothing in the room except for a bed. Even the wall was made of wood. So she couldn't kill herself even if she wanted to. Maisie and Sadai arrived at the room. The bodyguard outside of the room nodded at her before opening the door. They saw Rowena sitting on the bed. She looked like a mess, and her eyes were glassy. When she heard the commotion at the door, she lifted her head to look at Maisie and scoffed coldly. "Are you here to laugh at me?" Maisie walked into the room and said indifferently, "Nolan has given you to me." Rowena was stunned. She scrambled up from the bed agitatedly and asked, "What do you mean?" "It means exactly what you hear." Maisie walked to the side and took the tiny empty room. "He told me that I can do whatever I want to you." Chapter 569. Rowena froze. Suddenly, she cupped her head with her hands and laughed. "You're here to get your revenge, right, Maisie? You're here to kill me, right? What can you achieve by killing me?" She stared at her viciously and said, "If you kill me, will those people come back to life?" "Ha ha ha, do it then. I won't feel lonely when I have them with me in hell." Clenching her fist tightly, Maisie turned her head around and looked at her. "Who told you that you have the right to go down there and be with them? In other words, you can't kill me," Rowena said as she shrugged. There was a manic smile on her face, and she continued in a haughty manner. "Playing some dirty tricks is all you can do. Even if you hate me to the core, you can't even kill me." Maisie smiled and said, "Why should I get my hands dirty, because I hate you?" As she walked closer to Rowena, she said, "Daniel has gotten what he deserves for everything he has done. As for you, it will be a mercy if I kill you. And mercy is the last thing I want to give to you right now." Rowena grabbed the collar of her shirt and growled, "What the hell do you want? Do you think you can kill me?" A bodyguard came forward and pulled Rowena away. He pushed her, and she fell to the bed. Maisie dusted her shirt that got messed up by Rowena. "Do you want to experience whatever torture Nolan has been suffering for the past 3 years? What do you want to do?" Rowena's expression changed. Then, she saw Sadai come up to her with a briefcase. 2 bodyguards came forward and pinned her on the bed. She tried to resist, but to no avail. "Maisie, are you going to inject the virus into me? You can't do this to me. I want to see Nolan. I want to see Grandpa," she screamed. A bodyguard lifted his hand and slapped her in the face, causing her head to turn sideways. Soon, a red wheal appeared on her cheek. Maisie looked at her expressionlessly and said, "Sickness and pain are worse than death, especially when one dies at a place where no one can find them. Rowena shook her head but could only make a whimpering, choking sound. Losing your freedom, suffering from illness, and dying alone is the best place for you to end up. Maisie laughed. 2 bodyguards pinned Rowena tightly on the bed and covered her mouth. Sadie opened the briefcase and took out a syringe. Rowena screamed and shouted in despair, but whimpers were all she managed to squeeze out of her mouth. Tears began to fall from the corner of her eyes as Sadie injected half of the blue substance into her bloodstream. The bodyguards released her. Maisie glanced at her, turned around, and left. No, no. Don't go. I want to see Nolan. I want to see Grandpa. Rowena scrambled up from the bed, but her legs gave way, and she fell to the ground. She tried to make them turn their heads, but none of them did so. The door was closing up slowly until Rowena's cries of despair couldn't be heard anymore. Standing in the corridor, Maisie looked at the withered leaves that were blown down from the branches by the wind in the distance. Perhaps this was how Rowena would end up spending her life. 2 days later, Stoslow's Parliament building restarted the presidential election. Those people who supported Roger all had shifted toward Wesley. While Wesley was receiving interviews from the media and press, he said, "I won't let the people of Stoslow experience the same pandemic that happened back then. No matter if it's the government or the royal family, they should never try to hide or spread fake news about the pandemic. At the very least, I won't do that." Wesley had gained the support of most of the people, and even the netizens had liked the video of Wesley's interview. Of course, most of the netizens were happy that Stoslow was going to have its youngest ever president. While the doctor was drawing blood from Nolan for a blood test, the television on the wall was showing the news that Wesley had been elected as the president. Maisie was standing at the side. After the doctor left with Nolan's blood, she sat by the bed and asked softly, "Have you been feeling any better recently?" Chapter 570. Nolan smiled and grabbed her hand. "I'm not coughing anymore." Just when Maisie was about to say something, a figure appeared at the door. The newcomer was none other than Erwin. He was wearing a coffee-colored trench coat, making him look even more handsome and regal. "I hope I'm not interrupting you too," he said. Maisie hurriedly rose to her feet and asked, "Uncle Erwin, how is Mr. Kestner?" As Erwin approached Maisie, he replied, "Adrian is fine. He looks a little bit worn out, but he's doing fine." Strix had been very firm in his attitude when he went to get Adrian back from Roger. On the other side, Roger had been worried that Strix would make a big deal out of it, so he had no other choice but to let Adrian go. Robert was his milk cow while Daniel was his executioner, and Roger has become a lot weaker than he used to be after losing both of them, Nolan said as he tugged at his blanket. "Although he still has Sean and Gregory on his side, neither of them can pose a threat to us." Erwin nodded. Sean was just a businessman, and it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that he was Roger's errand boy. He did not have any family background and was not a noble, so it was easy to get rid of him. As for Gregory, without Roger's help, he wouldn't have been able to become a high-ranking officer in the government. However, a man's nature would be revealed when he gained power. People always said that the grass on the wall would always sway along with the wind. Now that the situation was not in Roger's favor, it went without saying that Gregory would not support Roger if he wanted to keep his position. "I heard that the descendant of the Hathaways has given Roger a large sum of money for him to monopolize the market of the vaccines," Erwin said as he looked at Nolan. Nolan chuckled. "Don't worry. He isn't someone who would suffer a loss." Erwin lowered his head and smiled. Roger now owes him a huge amount of money. I wonder how he is going to fill in the big hole. Maisie did not understand what they were talking about at all. When Erwin was leaving, Maisie walked him to the door. When they arrived at the hospital entrance, Erwin turned his head around and asked, "Z, after everything is over, are you going back to Morwich or to Zlokovia with him?" Maisie was stunned. After a short while, she said, I think I will go back to Zlokovia. I miss my other 2 kids. Erwin nodded, that's fine too. Maisie walked back to the ward. However, she heard a conversation from inside before entering the ward. You still haven't told Ms. Vanderbilt that Hernandez deliberately faked his disappearance and is actually dead? Nolan squinted his eyes. After a short while, he said, I'm worried that she can't accept it. But she will know about it sooner or later. As soon as he finished speaking, Nolan turned around and was stunned when he saw Maisie standing at the door. He rose to his feet and called out to her, Z. Maisie looked at him, her face calm. Did you already know that? The bodyguard exited from the ward, leaving both of them inside. Nolan walked up to Maisie, grabbed her shoulders, and said in a low voice, I'm sorry, Z. It's only until very recently that I learned about it. Maisie pressed her lips tightly and lowered her head. He grabbed her into his arms and secured her tightly in his embrace. As he kissed the top of her head, he continued. Z, trust me, this is the only thing I didn't tell you. I also just found out that your grandfather's disappearance was a scheme he set up to confuse those people. Maisie's body was trembling. She buried her head deep in his chest and asked with a shaking voice, so he's already dead? Right? Nolan grabbed her hand tightly, but he did not know how to answer her question. He knew that she might not be able to accept this outcome. Maisie pushed him away. There was a sad expression on her face, and her eyes were brimming with tears. Where is my grandfather? Nolan was stunned. After a long while, he wiped the tears at the corner of her eyes with his fingertip and replied in a husky voice, we can't find his body. He was already seriously injured on that day when the accident occurred, and he passed away not long after.